Dr. Malcolm Bennett, a black heart surgeon, saves Mrs. Eleanor Hughes, a racist woman, despite her refusal to be treated by him. When she wakes up, she surprises everyone by apologizing for her prejudice, thanking him for saving her life. Her transformation shows how compassion can break down the deepest biases and change hearts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Drop a comment below and let us know, where are you watching from? The fluorescent lights of Hillside Medical Center's emergency room buzzed faintly, illuminating the chaos below. Dr. Malcolm Bennett strode through the melee with the kind of focus that turned heads. His white coat billowed behind him like a cape, his name embroidered in bold blue letters over his chest. Dr. Malcolm Bennett, MD. His colleagues knew him as a man of unshakable calm, but tonight even he felt the tension creeping into his bones. Ambulance inbound, the head nurse called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. Cardiac arrest. ETA 2 minutes. Malcolm nodded, already donning gloves and snapping into action. It was a rhythm he knew too well. Every second mattered. The ambulance screeched to a halt outside, its blaring sirens fading as paramedics swung open the doors. On the gurney lay a frail woman, her ashen face framed by wisps of silver hair. Her eyes were shut, her lips faintly blue. 72-year-old female, the paramedic rattled off. Severe chest pain. Arrested en route. CPR initiated. Defibrillated twice. Possible myocardial infarction. Malcolm leaned over her, his sharp gaze scanning her vitals. Let's move. Trauma Bay 3. As they rushed her inside, the woman's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. A nurse leaned down to reassure her, but the woman's lips twisted into a faint snarl as she caught sight of Malcolm. Not you, she croaked, her voice barely audible over the beeping monitors. Malcolm froze for half a second, just long enough to register the words. He had heard them before from patients who saw the color of his skin before the degree on his wall. But this was no time to linger on insults. Mrs. Hughes, the nurse interjected, trying to soothe the woman. Dr. Bennett is one of our best surgeons. You're in good hands. No, she rasped, her frailty unable to mask the venom in her tone. Not him, anyone but him. The room fell silent for a beat. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Her heart rate's dropping. We don't have time for this. Prep her for the OR. The woman's protests weakened as her body betrayed her. Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes rolling back. The fight in her wasn't enough to override the fight for her life. As the team wheeled her away, a young intern whispered to Malcolm, "How do you handle that?" The racism, I mean. Malcolm didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on the gurney, disappearing into the operating theater. You don't handle it, he said quietly. You saved their life anyway. The intern fell silent, his respect for the surgeon growing with every step. The doors to the OR swung shut, and Malcolm took a deep breath. Tonight, it wasn't about pride or justice. It was about saving a life, even one that refused to see him as human. And Malcolm Bennett wouldn't let her die. Not on his watch. Dr. Malcolm Bennett strode through the chaos with a calm determination that seemed to silence the clamor around him. Nurses nodded in his direction, their frantic movements slowing ever so slightly as he passed. Malcolm had a reputation, not just for his unmatched skill in the operating room, but for his unshakable presence under pressure. At 38, Malcolm was a man who exuded quiet authority. His sharp features were softened by a perpetual kindness in his eyes, though they carried the weight of battles fought outside the sterile walls of the hospital. His dark skin, a source of pride to him, had also been the target of disdain from those who judged him before they even heard his name. Yet Malcolm never let those stares or whispered words chip away at his resolve. Today, he'd already performed 2 back-to-back surgeries, each one more complex than the last. Still, as he reviewed the chart handed to him by a nurse, his focus was laser-sharp. Critical condition. Female, 72. Acute myocardial infarction, the nurse said, her voice tense. She's being prepped for surgery now. Malcolm nodded, scanning the details. Prep the OR. I'll be there in 5. Dr. Bennett, the nurse hesitated, her expression uneasy. The patient. She's been adamant. She doesn't want you. Malcolm paused, his grip tightening on the chart. This wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Doesn't want me, or doesn't want a black surgeon? He asked evenly. The nurse glanced away, her silence confirming what he already suspected. Malcolm sighed, but didn't let the frustration reach his expression. I'll talk to her, he said finally, already walking toward the patient's room. Inside, Eleanor Hughes lay surrounded by monitors and 4 drips. Her frail frame was dwarfed by the hospital bed, but the sharpness in her blue eyes was anything but weak. As Malcolm entered, her face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Are you the surgeon? She demanded, her voice raspy but firm. I am Mrs. Hughes, Malcolm said, his tone steady. Dr. Malcolm Bennett. Her gaze swept over him, her expression hardening. I won't have you. Find someone else. Malcolm stood tall, his professionalism an armor against the sting of her words. Mrs. Hughes, I understand your concerns, he began, his voice calm. But your condition is critical. If we don't operate soon, you may not survive. I'd rather take my chances, she snapped, her eyes narrowing. Get me another doctor. There isn't another doctor available, he replied, his patience unshaken. And time is not on your side. Eleanor turned her head away, her silence more telling than words. Malcolm could see it, the fear beneath her anger, the vulnerability hidden behind the walls of prejudice she'd built over a lifetime. I took an oath to save lives, Malcolm said softly. All lives, Mrs. Hughes. Whether you trust me or not, my job is to ensure you see another sunrise. She didn't respond, but her hand trembled slightly on the bedrail. Malcolm's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned to leave. As he stepped back into the hallway, the young intern trailing him finally spoke. Dr. Bennett, how do you do it? Stay calm, Malcolm glanced at the intern, his expression thoughtful. Because this isn't about me, he said simply. It's about her. And whether she hates me or not, she deserves a chance to live. With that, he headed toward the operating room, leaving the intern standing in the corridor, awed and inspired. Eleanor Hughes had always been a woman of conviction. Her ironclad opinions were as much a part of her as her carefully styled silver hair and her pearl necklace, which she wore like armor. Sitting on her bedside table at home was a worn Bible and a weathered photo of her late husband, a man who'd shared her worldview and reinforced her beliefs. Eleanor believed in tradition, in the way things used to be, and she clung to it like a lifeline in a world that seemed to be changing faster than she could understand. But Eleanor's convictions were a double-edged sword. Beneath her genteel manners lay a streak of intolerance she rarely acknowledged, even to herself. She avoided the new grocery store staffed by immigrants. She grumbled when her neighborhood diversified. And when her neighbor's biracial granddaughter came to visit, Eleanor would close her curtains and mutter under her breath. Yet, her prejudices weren't born of malice, or so she told herself. They were habits, inherited and reinforced by a lifetime of people who thought the same way. It was the way she was raised, after all. And wasn't she entitled to her opinions? But now, lying on a gurney in the bustling ER, those convictions felt like chains. Her chest burned with a pain she had never known, a vice tightening around her ribs, stealing her breath. Nurses and doctors swarmed around her, their voices calm but urgent. Eleanor was barely conscious when she overheard snippets of conversation. Dr. Bennett is on his way. He's the best we've got for this type of surgery. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, and she struggled to focus. Who? She croaked, her voice barely a whisper. A young nurse leaned over her, concern etched into her features. Dr. Malcolm Bennett. He's a brilliant cardiothoracic surgeon, ma'am. You're in good hands. The words should have reassured her. Instead, they ignited a spark of panic. Bennett, she rasped. Is he? Her voice failed her, but the question hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. The nurse hesitated, a flicker of something. Pity? Annoyance? Crossing her face. Dr. Bennett is the best, ma'am, she said firmly, dodging the unspoken question. But Eleanor knew. She had seen his name before, his face in the hospital newsletter her neighbor had shown her, proudly declaring him one of the city's top doctors. A black man. No, she murmured, her weak voice rising in desperation. No, not him. I won't let him touch me. The nurse glanced at the monitor, its steady beeping now erratic. Mrs. Hughes, you need immediate surgery. Dr. Bennett is your best chance. Eleanor shook her head weakly, her frail body trembling. Find someone else, she whispered. The nurse's lips pressed into a thin line. There's no one else, she said gently but firmly. You'll die without this surgery. Eleanor's chest heaved, the pain blurring her vision, but her mind clung to its old, stubborn ways. Better to die, she thought bitterly, than to let someone like him touch her. But even as the thought formed, a cold dread began to creep in. Was this how it would end? Bound by beliefs she couldn't untangle, even in the face of death. As her consciousness faded, the sounds of the ER became a distant hum, and Eleanor was left with only one thought, a thought that pricked her pride and unsettled her soul. Would she really rather die than let a black man save her life? The emergency room was alive with a chaotic rhythm of urgency, shouting nurses, beeping monitors, the rush of gurney wheels against sterile floors. In the center of it all lay Eleanor Hughes, her face pale and clammy, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. She was slipping away, her heart teetering on the brink of failure. Dr. Malcolm Bennett stood at the foot of her bed, his steady eyes scanning her vitals. His hands, capable of miracles under the harsh glow of an operating room, were poised for action. This was a race against time. But then, the unthinkable happened. Eleanor stirred, her eyelids fluttering open, her gaze fixed on the tall, dark-skinned man in the white coat, leaning over her. It wasn't relief that crossed her face. It was something else entirely. Who are you?" she croaked, her voice weak but tinged with suspicion. "I'm Dr. Bennett," he said calmly, his voice warm and professional. "I'm here to perform your surgery. You've had a severe cardiac event, and time is critical." Her brow furrowed, her expression twisting into a grimace of disbelief. "No," she whispered, her words shaky but resolute. "No, I won't let you touch me." The room went still, as if the air had been sucked out. A nurse froze mid-step, her eyes darting between the patient and the surgeon. Dr. Bennett didn't flinch. He had encountered this before, racism, thinly veiled behind a curtain of excuses, or as raw and direct as Eleanor's protest. But here, in this moment, it was more than an insult. It was a life-or-death decision. "Mrs. Hughes," he said, his tone firm but empathetic, "I understand your concerns, but your condition is critical. Without surgery, you may not survive." Her lip quivered as she glared at him. "I don't care," she rasped, her breath shallow. "Get someone else. Anyone else." One of the nurses, a younger woman, spoke up hesitantly. "Dr. Bennett is the best, Mrs. Hughes. He's saved so many." "I said no." Eleanor snapped, her voice cracking under the strain. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Bennett's jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. He wasn't angry, not exactly. It was a kind of weariness, a bone-deep fatigue that came from fighting battles he hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore. A man's voice broke the tension. "What's going on here?" Eleanor's son, Robert, had arrived, his face flushed with worry. He approached the bed, his eyes darting to the monitors, then to Dr. Bennett. "Your mother needs emergency surgery," Dr. Bennett explained, his voice steady. "Her condition is life-threatening, and I'm the surgeon on call." Eleanor reached for her son's hand, her frail fingers gripping his tightly. "Not him," she murmured, shaking her head. "Anyone but him." Robert's expression hardened. He looked at Dr. Bennett, then back at his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice low but insistent, "this isn't the time for that. You need help." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but her resolve didn't waver. "I won't. I can't," she whispered. Dr. Bennett exhaled, a deep breath that steadied him. He glanced at the clock. Every second spent debating was a second closer to the point of no return. "I'm here to save lives," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That's my job, no matter who the patient is or what they think of me. But the decision is ultimately yours." He stepped back, giving her space, even as his mind raced through the implications. He had sworn an oath to do no harm, but what harm came from honoring a request like this? And what harm came from denying it? The room was thick with tension, a crossroads of life, death, and prejudice. The monitors beeped in warning. Eleanor's heart couldn't wait much longer. Finally, Robert turned to Dr. Bennett. "Do it," he said, his voice resolute. "Save her." Eleanor's eyes widened in shock, her lips parting to protest. But before she could speak, her body gave a violent jerk, and the monitor erupted into frantic alarms. Dr. Bennett sprang into action, his hesitation gone. There was no time for arguments now. Lives were saved in moments like this, not through words, but through action. And so, despite her resistance, the battle to save Eleanor Hughes began. Dr. Malcolm Bennett, a black heart surgeon, saves Mrs. Eleanor Hughes, a racist woman, despite her refusal to be treated by him. When she wakes up, she surprises everyone by apologizing for her prejudice, thanking him for saving her life. Her transformation shows how compassion can break down the deepest biases and change hearts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Drop a comment below and let us know, where are you watching from? The fluorescent lights of Hillside Medical Center's emergency room buzzed faintly, illuminating the chaos below. Dr. Malcolm Bennett strode through the melee with the kind of focus that turned heads. His white coat billowed behind him like a cape, his name embroidered in bold blue letters over his chest, Dr. Malcolm Bennett, MD. His colleagues knew him as a man of unshakable calm, but tonight even he felt the tension creeping into his bones. "Ambulance inbound," the head nurse called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Cardiac arrest. ETA 2 minutes." Malcolm nodded, already donning gloves and snapping into action. It was a rhythm he knew too well. Every second mattered. The ambulance screeched to a halt outside, its blaring sirens fading as paramedics swung open the doors. On the gurney lay a frail woman, her ashen face framed by wisps of silver hair. Her eyes were shut, her lips faintly blue. 72-year-old female, the paramedic rattled off. Severe chest pain. Arrested en route. CPR initiated. Defibrillated twice. Possible myocardial infarction. Malcolm leaned over her, his sharp gaze scanning her vitals. "Let's move." Trauma Bay 3. As they rushed her inside, the woman's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. A nurse leaned down to reassure her, but the woman's lips twisted into a faint snarl as she caught sight of Malcolm. "Not you," she croaked, her voice barely audible over the beeping monitors. Malcolm froze for half a second, just long enough to register the words. He had heard them before from patients who saw the color of his skin before the degree on his wall. But this was no time to linger on insults. "Mrs. Hughes," the nurse interjected, trying to soothe the woman. "Dr. Bennett is one of our best surgeons. You're in good hands." "No," she rasped, her frailty unable to mask the venom in her tone. "Not him, anyone but him." The room fell silent for a beat. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Her heart rate's dropping. "We don't have time for this. Prep her for the OR." The woman's protests weakened as her body betrayed her. Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes rolling back. The fight in her wasn't enough to override the fight for her life. As the team wheeled her away, a young intern whispered to Malcolm, "How do you handle that?" "The racism, I mean." Malcolm didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on the gurney disappearing into the operating theater. "You don't handle it," he said quietly. "You save their life anyway." The intern fell silent, his respect for the surgeon growing with every step. The doors to the OR swung shut, and Malcolm took a deep breath. Tonight, it wasn't about pride or justice. It was about saving a life, even one that refused to see him as human. And Malcolm Bennett wouldn't let her die. Not on his watch. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor reflected off the polished floors, creating a stark, sterile glow. Dr. Malcolm Bennett strode through the chaos with a calm determination that seemed to silence the clamor around him. Nurses nodded in his direction, their frantic movements slowing ever so slightly as he passed. Malcolm had a reputation, not just for his unmatched skill in the operating room, but for his unshakable presence under pressure. At 38, Malcolm was a man who exuded quiet authority. His sharp features were softened by a perpetual kindness in his eyes, though they carried the weight of battles fought outside the sterile walls of the hospital. His dark skin, a source of pride to him, had also been the target of disdain from those who judged him before they even heard his name. Yet Malcolm never let those stares or whispered words chip away at his resolve. Today, he'd already performed 2 back-to-back surgeries, each one more complex than the last. Still, as he reviewed the chart handed to him by a nurse, his focus was laser-sharp. Critical condition. Female, 72. Acute myocardial infarction, the nurse said, her voice tense. She's being prepped for surgery now. Malcolm nodded, scanning the details. Prep the OR. I'll be there in 5. Dr. Bennett, the nurse hesitated, her expression uneasy. The patient. She's been adamant. She doesn't want you. Malcolm paused, his grip tightening on the chart. This wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Doesn't want me, or doesn't want a black surgeon? He asked evenly. The nurse glanced away, her silence confirming what he already suspected. Malcolm sighed, but didn't let the frustration reach his expression. I'll talk to her, he said finally, already walking toward the patient's room. Inside, Eleanor Hughes lay surrounded by monitors and 4 drips. Her frail frame was dwarfed by the hospital bed, but the sharpness in her blue eyes was anything but weak. As Malcolm entered, her face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Are you the surgeon? She demanded, her voice raspy but firm. I am Mrs. Hughes, Malcolm said, his tone steady. Dr. Malcolm Bennett. Her gaze swept over him, her expression hardening. I won't have you. Find someone else. Malcolm stood tall, his professionalism an armor against the sting of her words. Mrs. Hughes, I understand your concerns, he began, his voice calm. But your condition is critical. If we don't operate soon, you may not survive. I'd rather take my chances, she snapped, her eyes narrowing. Get me another doctor. There isn't another doctor available, he replied, his patience unshaken. And time is not on your side. Eleanor turned her head away, her silence more telling than words. Malcolm could see it, the fear beneath her anger, the vulnerability hidden behind the walls of prejudice she'd built over a lifetime. I took an oath to save lives, Malcolm said softly. All lives, Mrs. Hughes. Whether you trust me or not, my job is to ensure you see another sunrise. She didn't respond, but her hand trembled slightly on the bedrail. Malcolm's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned to leave. As he stepped back into the hallway, the young intern trailing him finally spoke. Dr. Bennett, how do you do it? Stay calm, I mean. Malcolm glanced at the intern, his expression thoughtful. Because this isn't about me, he said simply. It's about her. And whether she hates me or not, she deserves a chance to live. With that, he headed toward the operating room, leaving the intern standing in the corridor, awed and inspired. The hospital buzzed with urgency, the rhythmic hum of monitors underscoring the gravity of life and death. Dr. Malcolm Bennett stood at the nurse's station, his gloved hands resting on the edge of the counter, the weight of a decision pressing down like a leaden fog. He had faced difficult cases before, complicated surgeries, long hours, but nothing quite like this. In room 204, Mrs. Eleanor Hughes clung to life, her frail frame barely visible beneath a tangle of wires and tubes. Her protests still echoed in his ears. I won't let him touch me. The words were laced with venom, spat out between labored breaths. Even as her heart faltered, her prejudice held firm. Nurse Patel approached, her face etched with concern. Dr. Bennett, she said quietly, her condition is deteriorating. We don't have much time. Malcolm nodded, his jaw tightening. I know. His gaze drifted toward the door of her room. Inside, He saw her daughter, a middle-aged woman with tear-streaked cheeks, clutching her mother's hand. The daughter had begged him to proceed, pleading for someone, anyone, to save the life of the woman she still loved despite her flaws. You could let someone else take the case, Patel suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Who? Malcolm asked, his tone sharper than intended. The on-call surgeon is across town, and her heart won't wait for traffic. Patel fell silent. They both knew the answer. For a moment, Malcolm allowed himself a flash of anger, a brief indulgence in the injustice of it all. Why should he have to save someone who refused to see his humanity, who would rather die than trust him? But then, as quickly as it came, the anger dissipated, replaced by a steely resolve. "Prepare the ore," he said firmly. Patel hesitated. "Are you sure?" She explicitly. "I know what she said," Malcolm interrupted. "But I also know that her daughter signed the consent form. And I didn't take an oath to save only the lives of the people who respect me." Patel nodded and hurried off, leaving Malcolm alone in the hallway. He took a deep breath and turned his thoughts inward, summoning the voice of his father, a man who had endured more than Malcolm ever would. "Son," his father had once told him, "the fight isn't in proving them wrong. It's in showing up, doing your job, and letting the truth speak louder than their hate." The door to room 204 creaked open. Mrs. Hughes' daughter looked up, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please," she whispered. "Please save her." Malcolm approached the bed. Mrs. Hughes was unconscious now, her breath shallow, her complexion ashen. The woman who had refused him minutes earlier was no longer coherent enough to object. "Mrs. Hughes," Malcolm said softly, though she couldn't hear him, "I'm going to save your life, whether you want me to or not." With that, he turned and strode toward the operating room, his mind laser-focused on the task ahead. Whatever anger or hurt he felt would have to wait. Right now, there was only the patient, the scalpel, and the relentless drumbeat of duty. As the ore doors swung shut behind him, the world outside faded into silence. Inside, Malcolm was already scrubbing in, his movements precise and deliberate. He didn't need her approval. He didn't need her gratitude. All he needed was to ensure her heart would beat again. The operating room buzzed with a tense energy as the surgical team prepared for the delicate procedure. Stainless steel instruments gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor created a steady, almost hypnotic beat. Dr. Malcolm Bennett stood at the sink, scrubbing his hands with meticulous precision, his mind focused but burdened. He was no stranger to high-stakes surgeries, yet tonight, the weight of something intangible pressed on him, the knowledge that the woman whose life he was about to save wanted nothing to do with him. "Dr. Bennett," came the soft voice of Nurse Patel, breaking through his thoughts. "The patient's vitals are stabilizing for now, but we need to move quickly." Malcolm nodded, his face calm but his jaw tight. He knew the whispers circulating among the staff. The intern, Jason, had seen Mrs. Eleanor Hughes' brief moment of consciousness when she learned who her surgeon would be. Her weak but pointed words echoed in Malcolm's mind. "I don't want him touching me." Jason had looked to Malcolm for a response, but Malcolm had simply turned away, masking his emotions behind the professionalism he'd spent years perfecting. Now, as he walked into the OR, Malcolm's eyes swept over the room. It was familiar territory, a place where race, prejudice, and social constructs typically faded behind the priority of saving lives. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt different. It was as if the tension had a pulse of its own, mingling with the faint hum of the ventilator. "Let's get started," Malcolm said, his voice steady but firm. He glanced at the anesthesiologist, who gave him a nod of readiness. "Scalpel." The first incision was made, and the room fell into an almost reverent silence, broken only by the soft exchange of instruments and the occasional beep from the monitors. Malcolm's hands moved with practiced precision, each motion deliberate and sure. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, a storm brewed. Every suture, every careful cut, carried a deeper weight. He wasn't just repairing a damaged heart, he was defying a narrative that had persisted for generations. Midway through the procedure, a sudden dip in Mrs. Hughes' heart rate sent a ripple of alarm through the room. Heart rate dropping, Nurse Patel said sharply, her eyes darting to the monitor. She's in V-fib, the anesthesiologist confirmed. Defib pads, Malcolm ordered without hesitation, his voice cutting through the tension. Charge to 200 joules. The team moved in sync, their training taking over. Malcolm placed the paddles against Mrs. Hughes' chest and delivered the shock. Her body jolted, and the monitor spiked briefly before flatlining again. Charge to 300, Malcolm said, his tone unwavering. Sweat beaded on his brow, but his hands remained steady. Clear. Another shock, another jolt. This time, the monitor showed a faint but steady rhythm. Relief rippled through the team, but Malcolm didn't pause. There was still work to do. As he sutured the final incision, the tension in the room began to ease. The steady beep of the heart monitor was now a reassuring presence, a reminder that life had been preserved. Malcolm stepped back, his gaze lingering on the frail woman lying on the table. Despite everything she'd said, despite her refusal to see him as anything more than the color of his skin, he had done what he swore to do: save her life. Good work, team, he said quietly, pulling off his gloves. His voice carried no triumph, only resolve. He knew this victory wasn't about proving her wrong, it was about staying true to himself. As the nurses began to clean up and prepare Mrs. Hughes for the recovery room, Jason, the intern, hesitated near the door. Dr. Bennett, he began, his voice tinged with hesitation. How do you do it? Knowing what she said, Malcolm turned to him, his eyes thoughtful. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Because it's not about her, Malcolm said finally. It's about the oath I took and the person I choose to be. Jason nodded, the weight of the lesson sinking in. As Malcolm left the oar, he felt the tension dissipate, leaving behind a sense of quiet triumph. The battle wasn't over, but tonight, compassion had won the first round. The operating room was bathed in sterile white light, the hum of monitors and the rhythmic beep of the heart rate machine the only sounds punctuating the tension in the air. Dr. Malcolm Bennett stood at the head of the table, his gloved hands poised with precision as his team moved around him in synchronized harmony. Scalpel, he said, his voice calm yet commanding. The nurse handed him the instrument, her gaze flicking to the unconscious figure of Mrs. Eleanor Hughes. Even sedated, her features betrayed a lifetime of resistance, a clenched jaw, lines etched deep from years of holding onto anger. Malcolm pushed the thought aside. Here, there were no prejudices, no grudges, only the delicate machinery of the human body and the unyielding duty to save it. She's crashing. The anesthesiologist's voice cut through the room. The monitor screamed as Eleanor's heart rhythm spiked and then plummeted. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Adrenaline now, he ordered. Time slowed as the nurse injected the drug. The seconds ticked away in agonizing slow motion. Malcolm felt the weight of the moment pressing on him, not just the life on the table, but the unspoken narrative that had brought them here. Here was a woman who wouldn't have allowed him to touch her if she'd been awake. And yet, her survival was in his hands. Restarting the bypass machine, he said, forcing his focus back to the task. Every move had to be perfect. The young intern assisting at the corner of the room watched with wide eyes, her breath caught in her throat. How does he stay so composed? She whispered to the nurse beside her. Because he has to, the nurse replied. And because he's Malcolm Bennett. The minutes stretched into an eternity as Malcolm navigated a maze of ruptured arteries and failing tissue. His hands moved with surgical grace, guided by years of practice and an unwavering resolve. Finally, the heart monitor stabilized, the erratic beeping evening out into a steady rhythm. A collective sigh rippled through the room. She's stable, the anesthesiologist confirmed. Malcolm stepped back, his shoulders sagging slightly beneath his surgical gown. He looked at the woman on the table, a stark contrast to the composed surgeon he'd been just moments ago. Let's close her up, he said, his voice soft but resolute. As the team worked to finish the procedure, the intern approached cautiously. Dr. Bennett, may I ask, how do you handle it? Knowing someone doesn't want your help. Malcolm turned to her, his eyes tired but warm. "It's not about how they feel about me. It's about the oath I took and the person I want to be. If I let her hate define me, I'd be no better than her prejudice." The intern nodded, the weight of his words settling in her chest like a seed waiting to grow. In the silence that followed, Malcolm glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight. He'd saved another life tonight, but the battle wasn't over. The true confrontation would come when Eleanor Hughes woke up and looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her life. And Malcolm was ready for it. The dim hum of hospital machinery filled the sterile air, a quiet symphony of beeping monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' footsteps. Mrs. Eleanor Hughes slowly regained consciousness, her senses sluggish, as if the world outside her mind was moving too fast for her to catch up. Her chest ached with the remnants of the surgery. For a moment, she wasn't sure where she was, or even what had happened. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing the soft glow of fluorescent lights above her. The sterile white walls of the recovery room came into focus, and the sharp smell of antiseptic stung her nose. "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice weak and foreign in her throat. A nurse, standing beside her, smiled gently. "You're in recovery, Mrs. Hughes. You've made it through the surgery. Everything went well." Mrs. Hughes blinked, her mind still foggy, and then, like a punch to the gut, an image pierced her consciousness. The moment before the surgery, when she'd first seen him, Dr. Malcolm Bennett, the black surgeon. Her breath caught in her throat. She was alive, but he had saved her. A wave of panic washed over her. She tried to sit up, her hands trembling as she grasped the edge of the bed. "Where's Dr. Bennett?" she demanded, her voice thin with emotion. The thought of his hands, those hands, having touched her, worked on her, made her skin crawl. How could he have touched her, when all her life she'd told herself such people weren't worthy of the same respect she gave others? The nurse, still smiling softly, seemed to misunderstand. "He's outside, checking in on some of his other patients. You'll get to speak to him when you're feeling stronger." Her heart raced, and her thoughts whirled. The room seemed to close in on her. Her hands gripped the sheets tightly as she willed herself to calm down. There was a pit in her stomach, a strange emptiness mixed with regret that she couldn't quite explain. Finally, the door to her room creaked open. A man walked in. A black man in a dark suit, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. Dr. Bennett. Her chest tightened. He stood there, not with the arrogance she had imagined, but with a quiet dignity that made her feel smaller, as though the prejudices she had held for so many years were suddenly unwelcome in her own skin. "You're awake," he said, his voice smooth, calm, and laced with a warmth she didn't expect. "I'm glad to see you're doing well." She swallowed hard, staring at the man who had just saved her life. The words she had rehearsed, the objections that had come so easily before the surgery, stuck in her throat. A strange mixture of gratitude and shame flooded her, threatening to overtake her. I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice unsteady. She had never been one to apologize, never for the things she truly believed in. But this felt different. Her thoughts churned with the weight of everything she had said, everything she had felt before the surgery. Dr. Bennett remained silent, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were soft, expectant. "I was wrong," she said, the words foreign on her tongue, like she was speaking a language she'd forgotten how to use. "I refused you because of your race. I was wrong to do that, to judge you before I even knew you. And I'm sorry." The room seemed to shrink around her. Mrs. Hughes could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, could feel the shame creeping up her neck. This man, this stranger, had risked his own reputation, his own peace, just to save someone like her. And here she was, admitting what she had fought so hard to deny, that her entire life had been built on false walls of superiority. Dr. Bennett didn't flinch. He didn't say a word at first, just let her words hang in the air. It wasn't until she couldn't meet his gaze that he spoke softly. "It's okay. We all carry our own burdens. What matters now is what we do with the chance to change." Her eyes snapped up to meet his, and for the first time, She saw something in him she had never expected, an understanding that went beyond words. He didn't hold her apology against her, nor did he ask for it. He simply acknowledged it, as though he had known all along that people could change, if only they allowed themselves to. "I'm just glad you're alive," he continued. "That's all that matters right now." Mrs. Hughes, still reeling from her own emotions, stared at him. She wanted to say more, wanted to ask him how he could be so kind, so accepting of her when she had been so terrible to him. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. It was the first time in her life that she felt like her walls, those walls she had spent years building to shield herself from the truth, had started to crumble. "I don't know how to make it right," she whispered. "You've already started," Dr. Bennett replied with a gentle smile. "The first step is acknowledging the truth. The rest will come in time." Mrs. Hughes closed her eyes, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. She had always thought she knew who she was supposed to be. But here, in the quiet of this hospital room, she realized that perhaps the person she thought she had been wasn't the person she needed to be. And maybe, just maybe, she had been given the rarest of gifts, the chance to change. The soft beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile recovery room, the rhythmic pulse of life now stable. Dr. Malcolm Bennett stood by the bed, his eyes scanning the charts as he observed Mrs. Eleanor Hughes, still deeply sedated. The storm of tension from the previous hours seemed to hang in the air, unresolved, like an unsung melody. The operation had been a success, despite the odds. He'd cut through her chest with the precision only years of training could provide, the very skill that had earned him respect in the operating room but not in every corner of the world. He wasn't sure when it had happened, whether it was the moment she had gripped his arm with a shaky hand or the look of utter defiance that had marked her refusal, but Dr. Bennett had never been so sure of his mission, to save lives. To prove that race, religion, and prejudice had no place in the most sacred of duties. He'd done it. He'd saved her life. But now came the moment of reckoning. Her eyelids fluttered, and a faint groan escaped her lips. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mrs. Hughes' eyes opened. The harsh white lights of the recovery room blurred into focus, and she blinked several times, trying to adjust. As reality returned to her, so did the memories of the chaos before the surgery. The events played back in fragments, a heated argument with her daughter, her objections to the surgeon's race, the thread of her life slipping away, and then nothing. Her gaze fell on Dr. Bennett, standing quietly by her side, his expression unreadable but kind. Mrs. Hughes' breath caught in her throat. You, she whispered, her voice cracked and hoarse. "Yes, Mrs. Hughes. It's me, Dr. Bennett," he said, his tone gentle but firm. He had seen many patients struggle with post-surgery confusion, but this was different. This wasn't just medical disorientation. This was the heart of it, the moment when someone confronts their most buried beliefs, faced with the reality of their survival. Her face contorted, the anger she had once clung to now replaced with something more fragile, vulnerability. For the first time, she looked at him not as a black man, but as a doctor, the one who had just given her another chance at life. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words faltered on her tongue. She looked away, unable to meet his eyes, as if the shame of her own heart might swallow her whole. Dr. Bennett took a step closer. "Mrs. Hughes, you're going to be all right. We got you through it." But she didn't hear him. Her hands, still weak from the anesthesia, clutched the edges of the blanket, as though trying to anchor herself to something solid in this storm of revelation. She swallowed hard and exhaled slowly, then whispered, almost to herself, "I didn't want you to save me." The words fell between them like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples of uncomfortable silence through the room. Dr. Bennett stiffened, but he said nothing. He understood the weight of her words, the deep-seated beliefs that had almost cost her life. His gaze softened, and he crossed his arms, waiting. "And I was wrong," she added, her voice breaking, the facade of defiance crumbling. "I was wrong about you, about all of them, about all of you." Her eyes welled up with tears, and she turned away, ashamed of the tears that threatened to betray her once unshakable pride. Dr. Bennett's heart clenched. It wasn't a grand, sweeping apology, but it was one that had taken her a lifetime to form. It was raw, unpolished, and as real as the heart that had beaten on its own for decades, even when she denied its very rhythm. This wasn't the moment he had expected. There was no grand speech, no flash of redemption. Just the quiet, painful acknowledgement that sometimes it's only through near-death experiences that we face the truths of who we are. I'm sorry, she whispered again, louder now, as though the words were finally finding their place in her chest. I was raised a certain way, and it was wrong. I'm sorry for what I said to you. For what I thought, for how I looked at you. Dr. Bennett nodded, a gentle, understanding gesture. We all make mistakes, Mrs. Hughes, he replied softly. But you're here now. And that's what matters. The apology hung in the air, unspoken between them, but fully felt. Mrs. Hughes' tears weren't just for herself. They were for every time she had turned away from someone because of what she had been taught to believe. They were for every moment she had missed because her heart had been closed. And for the first time, Dr. Bennett understood the true weight of what he had done, not just saving her life, but offering her a chance at something more, understanding. As the tension in the room began to ease, Dr. Bennett placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent promise that no matter her past, the future was still hers to shape. Take your time, Mrs. Hughes. We'll talk more when you're ready. And for the first time, she nodded, her gaze meeting his, no longer filled with fear or hate, but something softer. Something that felt like the beginning of change. The sterile white walls of the recovery room felt colder than usual, a stark contrast to the warmth that had filled the space just moments before. Dr. Malcolm Bennett stood near the window, his back to the room, as he let the sounds of the hospital fade into a dull hum. The surgery had been a success, but the weight of what had transpired, what still hung in the air, was heavy. He had saved Mrs. Eleanor Hughes' life. That much was undeniable. But what about the deeper scars that lingered, the prejudices that she had carried with her for decades? What had changed in her? Was this moment truly a turning point, or simply the temporary blurring of boundaries in the face of mortality? It was the question he had been asking himself all through the delicate procedure, as the tension in the operating room had threatened to smother his focus. He had pushed past the insults, the dismissive sneers, and the history of hatred embedded in her refusal. In that moment, Dr. Bennett had done what he always did, put aside his own pain to heal hers. But now that the adrenaline had worn off, the weight of that emotional sacrifice clung to him like an unspoken truth. A soft cough from the bed broke his reverie. He turned to see Mrs. Hughes awake, her eyes blurry with sleep, her lips parted in a tentative breath. The harsh fluorescent lights above her illuminated the struggle on her face. The old woman's brow furrowed as she slowly became aware of her surroundings, and then her gaze fell on him. The recognition didn't hit immediately. Her face, taut with discomfort, softened into confusion as she tried to place the figure standing beside her. Then it happened. A momentary flicker of realization crossed her eyes. You, Mrs. Hughes' voice cracked, the disbelief hanging thick in the air. You did it? Her words carried the weight of 1,000 judgments, of a lifetime spent dismissing people based solely on the color of their skin. And yet, there was no anger in her tone, no venom, only the rawness of someone forced to confront what they had never dared face before. Dr. Bennett didn't flinch, though his heart tightened in his chest. He nodded slowly, allowing her to process the situation at her own pace. This was her reckoning. He would not rush it. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words trembling as they left her lips. For a moment, Dr. Bennett thought he had misheard her. But no. Mrs. Hughes was looking at him, truly looking at him, for the first time in their brief, but pivotal encounter. There was no anger in her eyes now, only regret, remorse, and something else. Vulnerability. I never should have refused your care, she continued, her voice breaking. I was so wrong. The words came like a torrent, flowing from a place deep within her, a place she had buried beneath years of pride and fear. The tension in the room seemed to evaporate, replaced by a silence so profound it was almost sacred. She had come face to face with the truth that her prejudices were no longer her shield, no longer something that could define her. They had crumbled under the weight of her own survival. Dr. Bennett stood there, not knowing how to respond, unsure of what to say. The apology was not expected, nor was it what he had hoped for in the sterile coldness of the operating room. But it was real, and that was enough. It was more than enough. "You are scared," he said gently, his voice surprisingly steady. "I understand. Fear does strange things to people." Mrs. Hughes nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I was afraid of losing everything I thought I knew. I thought that if I let you help me, it would mean that everything I'd been taught, everything I'd believed, was a lie. And it scared me more than anything in the world." Dr. Bennett's mind raced, but he kept his composure. He wasn't interested in pointing out her flaws, in lecturing her about her past. He wasn't a teacher, and he wasn't here to make her feel small. He had learned that there were no easy answers to the tangled web of hatred and history that bound people to their fears. Instead, he smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that didn't seek to absolve her or excuse her actions. It simply acknowledged the moment for what it was. A beginning. "I think we're all just trying to make sense of the world," he said, his voice softening. "And sometimes we get it wrong. But that doesn't mean we can't change. That doesn't mean it's too late." Mrs. Hughes sniffed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know how to make up for what I've said, what I've thought. I don't even know where to start." Dr. Bennett took a step closer, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Start with yourself. Start by being honest. Not just with me, but with everyone you meet. And don't stop there. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with a single step. And you just took yours." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective, as though both of them had come to an unspoken agreement. No one was asking for instant forgiveness. No one was demanding that everything be fixed in an hour, or a day, or a lifetime. They were simply acknowledging the power of this moment. A moment where truth and vulnerability held more weight than any prejudice ever could. As Dr. Bennett turned to leave the room, he felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had done more than just save a life. He had opened a door to understanding, to healing, and perhaps to redemption. He could only hope that Mrs. Hughes would find the courage to walk through it. And maybe, just maybe, so would the world. Dr. Malcolm Bennett stood quietly by the window of his office, watching the city below pulse with life. The hospital, its walls still echoing with the tension of the past days, now seemed almost distant, a world apart from the personal revelations that had unfolded. He wasn't a man prone to sentimentality, but there were moments when the weight of his work, of his choices, seeped into him in ways he couldn't ignore. The world was complicated, and sometimes it felt as though change moved at a glacial pace. But then there were moments, like the one he'd just experienced, that made the struggle worth it. In the days that followed Mrs. Eleanor Hughes' surgery, things had shifted. The old schoolteacher, once so firm in her beliefs, had become a subject of conversation not just for her recovery, but for the change that had begun to take root in her heart. The people who had once whispered about her prejudice now whispered of her transformation. Of course, it wasn't immediate. Change rarely was. But Mrs. Hughes had made a decision. She would not allow her history to define her future. She reached out to members of her community, some of whom she had distanced herself from for years due to their race. And in her first brave step, she spoke publicly about her experience, not just as a woman who had been saved, but as a woman who had learned. It wasn't a perfect transition. There were bumps. There were awkward conversations. But in every moment of discomfort, Mrs. Hughes felt a stirring in her chest, a desire to be better, to do better. Dr. Bennett wasn't sure what to expect when he received the letter. Handwritten, it smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that seemed as odd as the words that appeared on the page. But the message was clear. She was changed. And she was sorry. "I was wrong, Malcolm," the letter read, her shaky handwriting confessing a truth she had long buried. I have spent my life thinking I knew the world, but you opened my eyes to kindness, to courage, and to the simple fact that we are all just human. I won't ever forget that. When he had read those words, Dr. Bennett had no grand reaction. There were no waves of triumph or bitterness, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing, no matter the personal cost. He had saved a life, yes. But more importantly, he had helped someone see the world through a new lens. As the hospital continued its daily rhythm, Dr. Bennett's name was still whispered in halls. He was still the surgeon who had performed miracles. But something more important had also begun to spread through the hospital. A quiet understanding was taking root among the staff, particularly the young intern, Jenna, who had watched the entire ordeal with wide eyes. Jenna had already learned how to perform surgeries, how to diagnose illnesses, but what she had witnessed with Dr. Bennett was something that couldn't be taught in textbooks. It was the power of quiet resilience, the impact of doing the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. One afternoon, as Dr. Bennett stepped into the break room for a quick lunch, Jenna approached him. She held out a notebook, her fingers nervously tapping against the cover. I wrote about it, she said, a bit embarrassed but determined. About what happened with Mrs. Hughes.
About you?
He raised an eyebrow, surprised by her boldness. What did you write? It's not much, she shrugged, but there was a spark in her eyes. It's about how you didn't just save her life. You saved her humanity. And in doing that, you made a difference in this hospital that goes beyond medicine. Beyond surgery. Dr. Bennett didn't speak for a long moment. He looked at the notebook in Jenna's hands and then back at her face. In that instant, he understood that the seeds of change had been planted, not just in Mrs. Hughes, but in the next generation of doctors, nurses, and even patients. His actions had set off a ripple effect, one that wouldn't be confined to the sterile walls of the operating room. It would spread to communities, to classrooms, to families, and maybe, just maybe, to a future where people like Mrs. Hughes wouldn't need to be taught, but would instead lead the charge toward acceptance and understanding. Jenna's words were a testament to that change. A legacy of hope, built on something as simple, yet as powerful, as a single moment of compassion. Dr. Bennett smiled and accepted the notebook. Thank you, Jenna, he said softly. I think this is exactly the kind of legacy we should all aim for. As he walked out of the break room, he couldn't help but think. Maybe the world wasn't changing overnight. But with each life touched, each heart softened, and each act of kindness, there was hope. A quiet, steady hope. And, in the end, that was enough. What do you think sparked Mrs. Hughes' change? Was it Dr. Bennett's compassion, or something deeper? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below.